Martin, Roberta Perna, and Daniela Vintila, and Angeliki Constantinidou from the ECPR Standing Group on Migration and Ethnicity. We are organizing this webinar, as I said, since a year now with changing topics. And we are very happy to have Julia Mourão Permoser and Martin Ruhs together here with us, discussing ethical dilemmas in migration policy making. I think a very topical issue that we just experienced a new showdown between Italy and the European Union in the last month, but there are many more ethical implications discussing migration and refugee policies, politics, and governance. I'm just briefly introducing the two speakers, and then I will give the floor to them. We will have more or less 30 minutes presentation, and then we open the floor for a general discussion with the audience. So Julia Mourão Permoser, she's a professor at the University of Vienna and senior research fellow at the University of Innsbruck. She has been working on the moral politics of migration since a while now during a project funded by the Austrian Science Foundation. And she's now, together with Martin Ruhs, but also together with Rainer Baubeck and Lukas Schmidt, co-directing a project on the ethical dilemmas in migration policy making. They will present the project together with Martin Ruhs, who is, as I said, one of the other co-directors. Martin Ruhs is co-director also of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute, and he's also a professor at the University of Oxford on leave currently. Julia and Martin will talk about the project overall, and then they will present two very specific dimensions related to ethical dilemmas. With this, I stop here and I give the floor to Julia and Martin.
Yes. Thank you so much, Verena. I will start and then pass on the word to Martin. Thank you for these kind words of introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about the ethical dilemmas of migration policy, about our project and our approach. What we will be presenting here today is a new research agenda. We have started within the framework of the project Dilemmas that is hosted at the UI. We are presenting or putting forward a new approach and a new theme within the political theory of migration. And we aim to bridge empirical political science work and normative theoretical work, bringing scholars together from these two areas to approach what we consider to be hard ethical dilemmas of migration policy. Now, what are hard ethical dilemmas of migration policy? We considered hard ethical dilemmas to arise in situations where a certain policy question that actors in the field are faced with, that they need to take a decision upon, they need to choose a particular course of action, when such an issue presents them with two conflicting moral values, two principles that are both in and of themselves something they would like to pursue, they would think it necessary to pursue and abide by, but they are in conflict with one another. And these ethical dilemmas are hard ones where these two principles cannot be put into a hierarchy. You cannot say, well, I'll privilege, say, human rights over sovereignty in the defense of borders because one is hierarchically, more important than the other. It is rather a situation in which the two moral values are of equal worth, and therefore the dilemma cannot be resolved simply by thinking through it. So any course of action that the actors decide to take will necessarily involve a moral cost. They will have to give up on something that they find themselves to be normatively, ethically important, worthy of pursuing. And what we propose is to take these ethical dilemmas, try to identify them, and analyze them in the following way. First of all, by really identifying and describing what are the two horns of the dilemma. What are the moral goals involved? And then to think through, either from the perspective of the actors in the field, what is the conflict that they are faced with, and then trying to develop a normative argumentation or analyze it from a more analytical way, how one could pursue a certain course of action, although knowing that the dilemma cannot really be resolved. Before I pass on to Martin, he will talk a bit more about this. I would like to point out that an important part of this research agenda is to differentiate these kind of ethical choices from other ethical choices that policymakers are also faced with. For example, issues of political feasibility. So sometimes actors are confronted with an impossibility, which might put them into a dilemma. They know which course of action they should pursue. But let's take the search and rescue in the Mediterranean that you, Verena, have already pointed out, and I'll be talking about later on more. So they might think that it's unquestionable that people should not be left to die, but they might think it unfeasible to pursue a certain course of action that would pursue that would fulfill that normative commitment. This is not a hard ethical dilemma in the way we are thinking about it. Rather, we are thinking about the cases where it's not just a matter of feasibility, but really, even if you had all the possibilities to pursue your goals, you would be faced with two goals that can not be reconciled. So you would have to choose a course of action that has a moral cost. So this is the broader framework. Before I pass on to Martin, I would like to point out that this is coming out of a special issue of Migration Studies, a journal of Oxford University Press. It has just been published. It's volume 10, number 3 of Migration Studies, entitled The Ethics of Migration Policy Dilemmas, where we are compiling a number of different cases and to such a dilemma. And we will be presenting 2 of them, as well as we have an introductory article that sets out the research agenda and defines what dilemmas are and how one should study it. So Martin, please add to or correct me if I said something which is not exactly right.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, as Julia said, I mean, we have defined the issue quite tightly, we hope, and as Julia said, as a situation where there's a persistent conflict of moral goals in the policy making process. And I suppose one reason why we think that it is important to think about the issue from this perspective is that it avoids what we often see in public debates, normative debates, but also political debates, which is some sort of reductionism. So we discuss the issue only in terms of one goal, and we deny, or some people discuss this issue only in terms of one goal and deny the existence and potential importance of the other goal. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that not everything in life is a dilemma, of course, and not every policy decision presents a dilemma. So one important question is the issue that we're discussing really a dilemma? Does it pose a real dilemma as we have defined it? That's an important question. But we think that these dilemmas are numerous, and as Julia said, they arise not only for policymakers, policy elites, but also for various policy actors in the field. So those that could be civil society organizations and others. So before we give 2 examples of dilemmas and our discussions of them, maybe I should just briefly say that we also think that Julia mentioned the bridging of political theory and social science research, but I think that these dilemmas can only be addressed, not resolved, but addressed, analyzed by analysis that really is multidisciplinary and that draws on both the kind of normative theorizing and thinking that a lot of political theorists engage in, and the some of the theories and empirical analysis that other social scientists conduct. So in terms of potential relationships between different policy goals and practice, the question to what extent some of these goals and moral values are actually perceived and embedded in societies. I think all these are very important questions, and in the special issue that Julia mentioned, except for one paper, all the papers are actually co-authored by a political theorist and a social science researcher who works more empirically to make sure that that integration is happening. So again, just briefly, before we go into our two different topics, two different dilemmas that I want to give us examples, I'll just run through the other ones that are in this special issue, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of dilemmas we have in mind. So there's one paper by Patty Leonard who focuses on low-income countries who restrict labor out-migration, especially of women, with the ostensible goal of protecting them. So as you know, when it comes to migrant workers in the Gulf states, there's a lot of exploitation, and some sending countries have resorted to imposing immigration bans. So there's a dilemma between kind of restricting the right to leave one's country, and on the other hand, the moral goal of providing some sort of protection. Another paper that is included is by Sarah Song and Irene Blumrad, working on regularization exercises, regularization programs, where we think there is a dilemma between, on the one hand, including migrants in society, especially those that have been there and have contributed in a particular way, on the one hand, and a rule of law principle on the other hand. There is Alex Aleinikoff and David Owen wrote a paper about refugee protection and the tension between where that protection takes place, protection in rich countries of the global north, or in poorer countries that are typically low-income countries. And Julia wrote about search and rescue with Itamar Mann, and Rainer Barberg and I have wrote about temporary labor migration programs. So what we're going to do now is just give you a flavor of the kinds of analysis that we've conducted in response to these dilemmas. So Julia, over to you for search and rescue.
Okay, thank you. So one of the dilemmas that we have looked into refers to the issue of search and rescue at sea in the Mediterranean. And in this paper, I have looked at it together with Itamar Mann, who is a legal scholar and legal theorist from the University of Haifa. And we were interested in thinking through the dilemmas of search and rescue as they present themselves to the rescuers. Yes. So search and rescue at sea, I guess you're all familiar with the issue. Starting 2014, 2015, European states, in particular Italy, withdraws its presence from the Mediterranean. The Operation Mare Nostrum, a state-led rescue operation that rescued a lot of people in the Mediterranean, is stopped. And at the same time, migration flows over the Mediterranean are at an all-time high with the humanitarian and crisis and violence and war in Syria. So we have a rising number of people coming through the Mediterranean, no rescue capacity, state-led at all. In this vacuum, civil society organizations and also some private initiatives, people who simply out of a sense of moral outrage and of civic duty, buy a ship, go to the Mediterranean and start rescuing people. The search and rescue in the beginning, the civil search and rescue by civil society actors is well seen by states, but with time, this relationship becomes increasingly tense, and search and rescue activists are accused of colluding with smugglers, and even if they are not willingly working together with smugglers, of contributing to the their exploitative business model, which consists in putting people at risk for profit, for money. Furthermore, it is argued by those who are criticizing search and rescue that by rescuing people in the Mediterranean, whether willingly or not, these civil society organizations are in effect leading to more people trying to undertake this journey, which will contribute to even more lives being lost at sea. So this is the famous argument of the pull factor, or infamous argument, right? So we come to a situation in which we have a principled form of activism by people who are at the same time engaging in a humanitarian act of rescuing, but also protesting against what they perceive to be a major case of social injustice. It's a contentious form of political action, but which is itself also the object of strong political contestation. And the legitimacy of this type of political activism is in question. And the ethical issues that we see in the media are very strongly portrayed from the perspective of states who are critical of search and rescue, whereas the rescuers are demonstrated as defending the ethical grounds, defending their position on ethical grounds. But we were interested in what are the dilemmas that present themselves to the rescuers from their perspective. What are the difficult quandaries, ethical, moral quandaries that they're faced with when they engage in rescue at sea? Do they see the same issues as being the big dilemmas of search and rescue, or are there others that present themselves to them more forcefully? So we conducted 25 interviews with rescuers from almost all the organizations, from 14 of 17 organizations that are present in the Mediterranean. And we asked basically the rescuers about the situations in which they were faced with ethical dilemmas, with what they considered to be ethical dilemmas. We drew on the literature on border externalization for our analysis. Very briefly, the concept of border externalization says that or describes the process by which states have created extraterritorial jurisdictions and spaces outside of jurisdiction, in fact, where they can avoid their own human rights commitments. Think of Guantanamo as a paradigmatic case, right? A space created and used by states to avoid their own human rights commitments and be able to pursue policies they would like to pursue, but are constrained by international and national constitutional or human rights obligations. In the Mediterranean, these extraterritorial spaces are created primarily through cooperation with third countries, and in particular with the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, whereby European states finance these third country actors to intercept boats at sea within the Libyan territorial waters and return them to Libya, which would be a pushback if carried out by European states and agents within international or European waters, but is not considered such if undertaken by Libya, or at least European states are not liable for that, because also Libya, and Libya is also not liable for that because they have never signed the Geneva Refugee Convention. So here you have a kind of pushback by proxy, a refoulement by proxy, and a way to circumvent human rights obligations by delegating the action that would be illegal if carried out by European states to a third party who is not liable for that, and European states are therefore also not liable for that. So here's just an overview of our interviews with the different types of position, activities, and so on. Let me come to the dilemmas themselves. What were the dilemmas identified by the rescuers, pointed out by the rescuers? The essence of the dilemma is the following. One side of it is what we know, what I have mentioned from the state perspective. So for rescuers as well, it is indeed an important quandary, ethical quandary, that they perceive that if they engage in rescue, which is a moral obligation in their view, people cannot be left to die. So they must act. There's a command of the conscience, a normative obligation to go and act to save lives. If they engage in this act of rescuing and follow their command of the conscience, They might, however, become implicated in the business model. Smugglers, they might indirectly be playing into a kind of exploitative business cycle, and more than that, maybe even to trafficking, because smuggling, you know, could also be seen as a simple service, might not necessarily involve any kind of extortion or exploitation. One might just simply pay for the journey, but in reality the lines are often blurred, and what initially starts as a process of paying for a smuggler becomes an exploitative relationship. People are not always completely able to manage and to delineate these relationships in the way they would like to. So often these are then turning into, if they're not from the beginning, a situation of forcing somebody, of extorting, and of using violence against migrants. So these situations present themselves very graphically to the rescuers, for example, in cases where somebody comes to them from a ship and says, would you take this person into your ship? This person there's somebody who is drowning over there. What do? Do they not act upon this information because it might be coming from a smuggler? Because the person that is saying that might be somebody who is within a trafficking network, and they would be helping that trafficking network? Or do they do act to save the people who are really in the water and needing help, and take into account that they will be participating in something that they would themselves normally reject and abhor? This is one side of the coin. But there is another side of the coin that for them is equally, if not more important, which is of the dilemma, that the same situation presents itself with regards to violent border practices of states, of European states, and of third country states like Libya. So they have the feeling that in order to engage in rescuing, which is their normative obligation as they see it, they need to turn a blind eye, or to cooperate even, and be co-opted into state practices that they reject. For example, in order to be able to rescue, if they identify any vessel which is at risk of sinking, they must first communicate this information to the maritime contact centers. They know, however, that the moment they communicate this information to a maritime contact center, this information will be forwarded to the Libyan Coast Guard, which will trigger a pushback operation. So they are indirectly then involved in an instance of refoulement to a country where it is known that migrants are at risk of torture and of being even sold as slaves, of suffering horrible human rights violations. And there are numerous other examples of how this dilemma plays out. But the essence is this: they are faced with a dilemma between rescuing and following their command of the conscience to really act in a humanitarian way, on the one hand, and then risking to become involved into exploitative or violent practices of either traffickers or states, including European states, or not rescuing, withdrawing, but then not following the command of the conscience in order not to get their hands dirty with these other chains of exploitation. How do they react to that? They react to that by trying to be as isolated as possible, turn the ship into an isolated space, which will have as little contact and as little knowledge about what is happening before departure in this one side of the chain that links the boat to the smugglers, and as little as possible to do with state authorities, as little knowledge as possible that can be communicated to state authorities as well about the migrants, about the circumstances of their trip, about the circumstances and the location of the ships, and where that information is coming from, in order not to be able to need to in order to not be forced to communicate that information to states which might be used against the migrants. So they try, we use this notion of counter externalization. They try to transform the ship into an externalized extraterritorial zone, but the opposite of what states do, where human rights apply, but state power is largely held at bay. So with this, I end. This is in essence, our argument in the paper, and I pass on to Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the paper that Rainer Barböck and I wrote as part of a special issue that looks at a different dilemma, namely a dilemma that we see in temporary labor migration programs. And so what we mean by a temporary labor migration program, a lot of people talk about temporary labor migration programs, but what we mean by it is a labor migration program that grants temporary residence and work permits on arrival. Now, some of these programs allow for a regulated transition to permanent residence, but we define it as a program that does not guarantee transfer to permanent residence. So, and these types of temporary labor migration programs, I mean, this won't be news to anybody working on labor migration, are the predominant form of regulating labor migration, certainly in high income countries. There's a long history and policy debates. Terminology has changed from guest worker programs to temporary labor migration programs to circular migration programs. More recently, we talk about skills partnerships that are essentially also involve temporary migration. And there has been a growing body of normative analysis. So the ethics of temporary labor migration programs, well-known critiques that are usually based on human rights, on equal membership or on exploitation. And people who justify and defend such programs typically do that based on an argument that invokes the triple wins. So can we design programs so that everybody wins? The migrants, the countries of origin, and the host country. And I think a common question in the ethics of temporary labor migration programs is, which rights of temporary labor migrations can be justifiably restricted and for how long? Keeping in mind that even though there's a great variation of temporary labor migration programs around the world, all such programs restrict at least some of the rights of migrant workers. Most commonly access to welfare state, but typically also the right to free choice of employment, because such programs are typically restricted to specific sectors or occupations of the host country's labor market. So what we wanted to do is, rather than kind of engage in this discussion of which rights can be justifiably restricted and for how long, we start from the idea also of the larger project that there really is a dilemma here. And the way we see the dilemma in temporary labor migration programs is that there's a fundamental tension, an inescapable tension in all such programs, no matter how they are designed, between global justice and domestic justice. Global justice, because temporary labor migration programs open up opportunities for workers, for people in poor countries to access labor markets of rich countries. According to the World Bank, there is no more effective strategy for raising the incomes of people in poor countries than to give them a job in a rich country. So temporary labor migration, more labor migration opportunities to rich countries is a major way of reducing global inequalities. And from a global justice point of view, should be a good thing, opening up more opportunities for labor migration. At the same time, there's domestic justice, and at least in liberal democratic countries, one key aspect of domestic justice is equality, equality of rights for residents in the polity. So, as I mentioned before, although the models vary across countries, all temporary migration programs, regardless how they're designed, involve at least some restrictions of migrants' rights. So you have that tension that on the one hand, from perspective of global justice, temporary migration programs are desirable. From the from the from the perspective of domestic justice, they always raise concerns because of this inequalities in rights vis-a-vis residents. So what we wanted to do in the paper is find a way of thinking about how one might respond to that dilemma. And again, I think we're repeating ourselves, but it's important. No response will resolve the dilemma. I think no matter what you do, the dilemma remains. So there will always be moral cost to any policy response. But we do think that there are ways of responding to the dilemma that might be morally acceptable and justifiable. And our approach is basically to say, rather than saying which rights restrictions are acceptable or not, we ask that under what conditions are temporary migration programs acceptable or even recommendable. And we basically make an argument that what's really key to the normative acceptability or even desirability of temporary labor migration programs is what we call fair representation in such programs. And I'll spend kind of a couple of minutes going through the basic argument. I won't go into the detail because there's no time for that. There's the paper, we can discuss it in the Q&A. But basically our starting point is, so we take the triple win seriously, in the sense that we do think that that is an important point, that such programs can, in principle, generate benefits for all sides, receiving country, sending country, and migrants. But in our view, the only way in which you can actually secure these benefits, the only way in which you can actually be sure, or you can actually make the assessment as the benefits, is if the actors themselves are involved. So that means the simple reason is that migration creates lots of different consequences, including trade-offs for host country, for sending country, and for migrants themselves. So migrants might benefit economically, but there might be all kinds of rights costs or psychological costs from migration. And it's only the actors themselves that can normatively put weights on these different types of benefits and who can decide whether or not overall migration is desirable for them or not. So I think the actors must be involved in any assessment of triple benefits. It's not good enough to say, in theory, if we design programs in a certain way, then this could be good for migrants and sending countries as well. And what the paper does is basically talk through a number of conditions that we think need to be met. And we have justice conditions and what we call democratic legitimacy conditions. And the justice conditions basically say that the programs need to meet basic human rights, by which we mean basically civil and political rights and basic labor rights. Migrant participation must be voluntary. We can discuss what that might mean. And our perspective is that rich destination countries do have global justice duties. So they're under some duty to do something about global inequalities. And temporary labor migration programs might be one way in which those global justice duties can actually be delivered. And the key of the argument really then is within the democratic legitimacy conditions, which basically says that we need to have fair representation. So all affected parties, all affected interests must be represented in the design and decision-making about such programs in order to secure the triple benefits. And so that's what we mean by fair representation, that everybody basically is involved in this and can recognize each other's benefits as being legitimate. A second democratic legitimacy condition that we talk about is equal protection by the laws. So we don't think that there's necessarily equal inclusion required in terms of citizenship in a host country, but there is, I think, a strong standard for equal protection under host country laws. And finally, when it comes to citizenship, we argue for local citizenship rights in host countries and for national citizenship rights in origin countries. Again, I can go into more detail, but basically what that means at the end of the day is that some of these conditions put a limit around what is acceptable and what is desirable, but some of these rights remain up for negotiation, then for legitimate negotiation between these different affected parties. And I'll conclude just, the paper is kind of meant to be theoretical and I mean, it's meant to be helpful to inform practical debates, but there are three obvious challenges, I think. One is, if you have these international cooperation negotiations about temporary labor migration programs, how do you deal with these power asymmetries between rich host countries and poor ascending countries? A very thorny question is how you could best represent the interests of migrants themselves, which is not a straightforward issue at all. And a lot of our paper really assumes that countries care about certain democratic principles and values. Now, we know that a lot of labor migration happens to non-democratic countries or even from non-democratic countries. So I think there's a question to what extent some of what we are saying applies to those countries as well. Again, this is just another example of a dilemma that we think exists, and there's various different ways of thinking about how to address this dilemma, and this has been our attempt to do exactly that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you very much, Julia. Very fascinating topics and very fascinating overall project, so congratulations.